I used to believe dementia happened to other people. The very old, the very sick, the unlucky. Not my family, not my mind. But the first time I forgot my sister's birthday, not the date, her name, I felt something cold move through me. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like the movies. It was quiet. Dementia doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives with whispers. A misplaced word, a missed appointment, a story repeated twice, then 3 times. At 68, I told myself it was normal aging. At 72, my sister stopped recognizing her own kitchen. At 75, she asked me who I was. That was the day I realized something terrifying. You don't lose memory all at once. You lose it slowly. And by the time you notice, the process has often been building for decades. I am 85 years old now, and I still know who I am. Not because I was lucky, but because I changed the way I lived. Tonight, I want to tell you what I learned, not from headlines, not from internet trends, but from watching someone I loved disappear and from studying what actually protects the brain. If you are over 40, this matters. If you are over 50, it matters more. Because dementia is not only about age, it is about patterns. And patterns begin early. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I was a school teacher for 38 years. I raised 2 sons. I buried a husband. And I watched my older sister, Margaret, slowly drift away from herself. Margaret was brilliant. She could recite poetry from memory, balance accounts in her head, solve crossword puzzles in ink. Dementia did not care. That is something I need you to understand. It does not discriminate based on intelligence, or education, or success. It cares about biology, inflammation, stress, blood flow, isolation. It cares about the quiet habits we repeat for decades. When Margaret was diagnosed, I went home and sat in silence. I was 70 years old. And for the first time in my life, I asked, what am I doing to my own brain? Because here is what most people misunderstand. Dementia is not only something that happens in your 80s. The damage often begins in your 40s and 50s, long before symptoms. That truth changed me. The signs we ignore. Let me tell you something most people misunderstand. Memory does not disappear first. Confidence does. Margaret began doubting herself before she began forgetting. She would say, I'm just tired. I'm not as sharp as I used to be. Maybe I'm just getting older. These statements seem harmless. But when the brain struggles subtly, it often signals distress before failure. There is something called cognitive reserve. It's the brain's resilience buffer. Some people can tolerate early neurological changes without obvious symptoms. But once that reserve is exhausted, decline accelerates. Margaret had a brilliant mind, but she depleted it slowly through years of unprocessed stress and unresolved grief. Chronic sleep deprivation, emotional overextension, and here is something even harder to admit. She never believed her mind deserved protection. She protected everyone else, except herself. The brain is not only biological, it is environmental. It reflects the life it is forced to endure. People who carry too much for too long age differently. This is something researchers rarely phrase this way, but I've lived long enough to see it clearly. Chronic emotional caretaking increases cortisol levels. Long-term cortisol exposure damages hippocampal neurons, reduces synaptic density, impairs memory consolidation, weakens stress regulation systems. The body can recover from short stress. It cannot thrive in permanent vigilance. Margaret never stopped bracing, and bracing is exhausting. The invisible early signs. Before diagnosis, there are whispers, subtle, taking longer to process conversation, becoming irritated by small cognitive demands, avoiding complex tasks, withdrawing socially, relying heavily on routine to mask confusion. These are not dramatic, but they're important. The earlier the brain feels supported, the more adaptable it remains. This is why prevention begins long before crisis. Let's talk about inflammation. Not the kind you feel in your joints, the kind you cannot feel. Chronic low-grade inflammation damages blood vessels in the brain. It disrupts communication between neurons. It accelerates plaque buildup. And inflammation is fueled by poor sleep, chronic stress, high-sugar diets, sedentary living, unmanaged medical conditions. Your brain floats in a chemical environment created by your habits. If that environment is hostile, your brain adapts defensively. Defensive adaptation over decades becomes decline. The brain loves rhythm. This is something I learned late. The brain thrives on predictable rhythms. Consistent sleep time, consistent movement, consistent meal timing, consistent social contact. Irregular living strains neurological stability. Margaret's schedule was chaotic. She stayed up late worrying. She skipped meals. She oscillated between isolation and exhaustion. The brain likes stability. Stability builds resilience. What protects the brain? Let me tell you what changed my trajectory. Not one grand decision. Small daily disciplines. 1. Walking, but with intention. When I walk, I don't scroll my phone. I observe. Trees, wind, people. Observation activates attention networks. Attention networks preserve cognition. Movement combined with awareness strengthens neural pathways more than passive movement. 2. Learning something slightly difficult. Not comfortable, slightly difficult. Difficulty stimulates growth. When the brain struggles in controlled ways, it strengthens. I read things outside my comfort zone. I practice memory recall intentionally. I challenge myself to remember phone numbers. Small stress in safe amounts strengthens resilience. 3. Social depth, not quantity. You do not need many friends. You need meaningful conversation. Conversations that require reflection. Debate. Laughter. Story recall. Emotion. Social depth stimulates more brain regions than shallow interaction. 4. Protecting sleep aggressively. I treat sleep as sacred because sleep is not passive. It is active repair. Deep sleep activates the glymphatic system, which clears metabolic waste. Without it, the brain accumulates debris. That debris builds quietly, over years. The role of purpose. Retirement is dangerous for some minds, not because of inactivity, because of identity loss. When identity dissolves, motivation declines. When motivation declines, stimulation decreases. When stimulation decreases, the brain weakens. Purpose is neurological fuel. You do not need career. You need meaning. Meaning increases dopamine stability. Stable dopamine supports motivation. Motivation drives engagement. Engagement preserves cognition. Purpose is biological. What I did differently. At 70, I made a quiet promise. I would not drift. I structured my days. Morning walk. Reading hour. Phone call to a friend twice weekly. Regular doctor visits. Sleep schedule. Small mental challenges. None of it dramatic. All of it consistent. Consistency compounds. The brain responds to repetition. Fear does not protect the brain. Discipline does. When Margaret was diagnosed, fear entered our family. But fear did nothing. Discipline is quiet. It repeats small actions daily. It protects long before crisis. What you can start today, not next year. Today, walk 20 minutes. Sleep 30 minutes earlier. Call someone and ask meaningful questions. Learn one new thing. Schedule a medical check. Reduce unnecessary stress. Prevention is not dramatic. It is ordinary. Repeated. At 85, I remember my childhood home. I remember my husband's laugh. I remember Margaret before the fog. Memory is identity. Identity is continuity. And continuity is not accidental. It is protected. You may not control everything, but you influence more than you think. Your brain is not fragile glass. It is living tissue, responsive, adaptable, listening. If you treat it like something precious, it often stays with you longer. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. And meaningful memory is enough. At 85, I still know my sons' names. I do not say that lightly. There are women my age who cannot say that. I remember my wedding day. Not perfectly, memory is never perfect, but I remember the feeling, the nervousness in my hands, the way the air felt heavy with expectation, the sound of quiet laughter before the ceremony began. I remember my sister's laughter before the fog took her. It was bright, quick, unrestrained, long before her sentences shortened, long before confusion replaced certainty. And I remember the promise I made to myself: I will not drift passively. I will participate in my own preservation. That promise changed everything. When Margaret's diagnosis became official, something inside me settled. Not fear, clarity. I realized there are two ways to age. You can surrender to it blindly, or you can participate in it intentionally. Most people think decline is dramatic. It is not. It is subtle. It is quiet repetition. It is small neglect compounded. But preservation is also repetition. Small discipline compounded. At 70, I was not certain I could influence my future mind. At 85, I know I could. Not completely, not perfectly, but meaningfully. If you are listening now, you are earlier than you think. That sentence matters. Because people often wait for symptoms. They wait for warning signs. They wait for urgency. But protection works best when nothing feels urgent. The brain responds to decades, not days. Walk tomorrow, but not to punish yourself. Walk to signal vitality. Call someone, not to fill silence, but to stimulate connection. Learn something small, not to impress anyone, but to stretch neural pathways. Sleep deeply, not because you are weak, but because you are repairing. Protect your peace, not because the world is cruel, but because your nervous system needs safety. Let me tell you something else that aging has taught me. The brain does not only store memory, it stores emotional tone. If your days are constantly frantic, your brain learns chaos. If your days are grounded, your brain learns stability. Stability builds resilience, and resilience slows erosion. When I began simplifying my life, people thought I was shrinking it. I was not shrinking it. I was stabilizing it. I removed unnecessary drama. I declined obligations that drained me. I reduced exposure to constant noise. The modern world is overstimulating. The brain was not designed for endless interruption. Constant notifications, rapid information shifts. The brain fatigues under constant stimulation, and fatigued brains are less adaptive. So I made my world quieter, not smaller, quieter. There is a difference. At 85, I no longer chase urgency. I chase clarity. Clarity requires space. Space requires boundaries. Boundaries protect cognition. You cannot preserve your mind if you never rest it. You cannot strengthen it if you never challenge it. Balance matters. Movement and stillness. Connection and solitude. The brain thrives in dynamic balance. Dementia is not always preventable. There are cases that defy discipline. There are genetic risks we cannot override. But decline is not always inevitable either. That is the quiet truth. There is influence. And influence is powerful. Small habits, walking daily, learning continuously, sleeping deeply, managing stress, sustaining connection. They may not guarantee immunity, but they shift probability. And sometimes shifting probability is enough. There is something deeply human about wanting to remember. Memory is identity. When memory fades, identity softens. And identity is how we remain recognizable to others and to ourselves. I watched Margaret slowly forget her own stories. At first, she forgot details. Then she forgot context. Then she forgot people. That loss is not only cognitive, it is relational. Memory anchors relationships. When memory fades, relationships strain. I decided I would fight for my anchors. Not aggressively, not desperately, quietly, steadily. If you are under 60, you have extraordinary advantage. The brain changes slowly. That means protection works slowly too. Start now, not dramatically, not obsessively, simply consistently. Your 85-year-old self is waiting to see what you choose repeatedly, waiting to see whether you invest in clarity. The future you is not distant. It is cumulative. There is another truth aging reveals. Fear accelerates decline. Fear keeps the nervous system activated. Activated nervous systems struggle to repair. When Margaret became afraid of forgetting, her anxiety worsened her confusion. Calm supports clarity. This is why I do not speak about dementia with panic. I speak about it with intention. The brain listens to emotional tone. Even now, especially now. At 85, I have lost things. People, energy, certainty about how much time remains. But I have not lost myself. And that matters. You do not need perfect memory. You need meaningful continuity. You need to recognize yourself in the mirror. You need to remember who you love. You need to remember what matters. That is enough. Aging does not have to be surrender. It can be participation. Participation requires attention. Discipline requires care. Care requires belief that you are worth protecting. And you are. Even if you have spent decades protecting others. Even if you feel behind. Even if you think it is too late. It is rarely too late to improve trajectory. The brain is adaptable longer than we assume. Neuroplasticity persists. Connection still stimulates. Movement still nourishes. So treat your brain gently. Challenge it wisely. Rest it intentionally. Feed it thoughtfully. Connect it meaningfully. Structure your days. Reduce unnecessary stress. Attend to your health. Honor your limits. Protect your peace. And do not drift. Drifting feels easy. Participation feels deliberate. Choose deliberate. Thank you for sitting with me. In a world that rushes everything, you chose to listen slowly. That alone is protective. If this conversation mattered to you, subscribe to Questions for My Elders, where wisdom is not rushed. And if you are under 60, start now. Your 85-year-old self is not distant. It is becoming. Make choices today that your future mind will thank you for, because memory is what you protect, and you are still in time